Hey guys, welcome back to Andy's Dinosaur Reviews, and today we have ourselves something that is quite interesting, as we've got ourselves a concept art version of the Indoraptor. This is a figure made by Oenux, and it's interesting, that's for sure. For a little while, I actually didn't realize what this figure was. I had seen it on the Aliexpress page for a little while for sale, and I thought it was very interesting, and one day I may pick it up. And then recently I was like checking out some Jurassic World concept art, and I came to the realization that it's actually a version of the Indoraptor that they were creating. If you take a look at this image here, you can see what the actual concept art for the Indoraptor looked like, and obviously Oenux has gone ahead and recreated that here with their own version, which I actually think is really cool. That was actually a very intelligent idea, I would say, on the part of Oenux to create something so unique and something that, as far as I'm aware, we don't really have any figures out of. And I would say for the most part, they got it down pretty good when it comes to the overall appearance everywhere except for the head sculpt. I feel like the head sculpt is definitely off, and that's that one area that they kind of messed the figure up a little bit. But if you can look past the awkward looking head sculpt, it is a really quite cool looking interpretation of that concept art version of the Indoraptor. And the coloration is kind of similar here on this one compared to what you saw in the concept art as well. Not exact, they did switch it up a little bit and alter things a little bit compared to the original version, but it's not too far off. It doesn't stand so well, though, I will say that. Kind of has to like lean back as you go up. See, starts to fall. Not the best standing figure, that's for sure, but it is quite interesting regardless. So as always, let's go ahead and jump straight to a closer look, and we'll check it out from there. So starting up here at the head sculpt of the figure, you can see again the likeness as far as what the head sculpt of the Indoraptor has. It's not so great. Definitely doesn't really look like the Indoraptor. I mean, it has some slight similarities, but I absolutely wouldn't say that they've captured the likeness. Really not much at all as far as the head sculpt goes. Just slightly, I would say. But you can also see the skin texture is very strange looking on this figure. It is really quite crisp, and overall actually looks kind of decent, but it's not scale detail. It's more like almost kind of giving it like a slightly, I don't even know what to say as far as the look. Like here on the face, it almost looks like feathering or like fur, but it's just kind of like a whole lot of creasing and stuff that they've given the figure, which is very strange and definitely gives the figure a strange look overall, especially as you move back into the body. But I will say the paintwork here of the face outside of the mouth anyway looks pretty cool, as we have variations of like kind of almost like reddish browns and blacks that sort of transition back and forth very smoothly. I think they did a pretty good job as far as the paintwork goes, again excluding the mouth. Here on the head sculpt of the figure, there is also a little blue here around the eye, and then an eye painted with a black and an orange dot. I don't know if that's meant to be the pupil or what. It does look pretty interesting, and it also has a nice gloss coat, but the figure overall has a bit of a satin shine to it. But I will say the paint of the eye actually looks kind of decent for what it is. It's just not exactly what you see on the, concept art for the Indoraptor, but it actually, again, looks okay. This eye actually is placed, I think, a little nicer than the other one. Surprisingly decent, because a lot of the time when you get figures like this, especially from Oenux, they end up being a little bit sloppy. The teeth are sculpted out, not really in an Indoraptor-ish way, and I feel like, outside of the shape of the head, the teeth and the way that they're sculpted is the one thing that's probably furthest from the original concept art on this, in quotation marks, Indoraptor. You can see that they're okay, but pretty sloppy, especially on this side when it comes to the paintwork. Same deal for the teeth on the lower jaw. It's amazing that they can have pretty nice looking paintwork for the eyes, and then when they get to the mouth, they're just like, oh well, I don't care anymore. It honestly seems like a very common trend when it comes to Oenux figures. You can see the tongue looks pretty darn good actually on the inside of the mouth. It's sculpted nicely, also painted nicely, and sports a gloss coat on the inside of the mouth as well. The detailing on the upper side of the inside of the mouth looks pretty decent, but not really anything to rave over. As we lead back, we do have a frill for our Indoraptor, and you can see that has some pretty nice looking texturing and stuff to it. almost looks reminiscent to the frill of the Dilophosaurus from Jurassic Park when it comes to the way that the skin looks. Like, that Dilophosaurus has a very interesting kind of trademark skin texture, fairly reminiscent to what we have here on this version. You can see that the outer edges are kind of cool looking as well, because they look almost like inconsistent, like they're torn up a little bit, and I think that's actually a pretty neat touch as well. If you come up here to the top of the head and we kind of try to sneak back behind the frill, we're not going to be able to get back there because it is so dark with these dark tones, but you can see the back of the neck, and the paintwork continues to look pretty much the same way, with the kind of mixtures of like reddish browns and blacks up here in the frill, as well as moving back into the body. And it's once we get back into the body that I think the skin texture starts to look really awkward, because you can see it literally is just like lines and creases and stuff. Like, there's no real attempt to give it any sort of scale, detail, or anything like that, which is a bit of a bummer, because I feel like the figure did have some pretty decent potential. As you move down into the arms, you can see the muscle definition is kind of displayed there. You also have all of the claws and everything here exactly as you see on the concept art for the Indoraptor, including this very interestingly placed claw up here, and it looks pretty decent. The nail paint as well, painted with a lighter variation of a gray, also looks pretty good. I like the positioning of the fingers and everything here on the model as well. As you lead back into the stomach, you can see a little tiny bit of girth in the stomach. It's not quite as sleek and slender as the actual design of the Indoraptor that you see in the film, or at least not so much as far as this figure goes. You can kind of make out the hip bones slightly, but not really a whole lot. You can see the muscle definition as you move down into the thigh, though. A little bit more obvious as far as that reddish brown sort of tone here in the front of the thigh. As you move down, you've got the calf muscle again. We've got the very interestingly sculpted feet with the claws and everything that also looks quite reminiscent to the Indoraptor concept art. You've got some scoots running down the toes. Again, the nails are painted with a light gray like we saw up there on the hands. And then we lead out, we've got a really nice curve in an upward fashion for our Indoraptor. And then as you lead out to the tail, you have what I would imagine would be thagomizers out here. And they kind of face in a downward position, which is interesting, but also kind of looks again like the concept art does. I will say they really were reaching out there when it comes to the design of this version of the Indoraptor. And then when you take a look at the opposing side, you can see the head is pretty straightforward. You can see the arm is slightly more forward than what we have on the opposing side, and the same deal can be said here for the leg, as the leg is taking a step forward, so it's a little bit different than what we saw on the opposing side. And then you move out through the rest of the figure, and the tail does curve away from us, but it's not like any sort of a drastic curve. There's also some sort of like white spot here. I don't know if that's a paint chip or what that is. I'll have to look into that here in a minute, but overall, again, for what it is, it's kind of cool. I actually thought, once I had realized what it was, I was like, wow, that's actually pretty unique and not something that I've really seen before. So I did place an order for it right away, and got one here to check out with you guys, because even if it isn't the most perfect representation of that concept art Indoraptor, it is at least a version of it that you can have in figure form, which I think is pretty cool. As far as a size goes, for a length from the snout to the tail, about 8.5 inches, or right around 21.5 centimeters. And then for a height, the highest point would probably be the frill, about 4.5 inches, or around 11.5 centimeters. For a size comparison, there is Mr. Papo T-Rex, the Attack Pack Colovosaurus, Robert Muldoon, and the Collect A Human Being next to our concept art version of the Indoraptor, and you can see it's got a pretty decent size. It's not massive by any means, but has an okay size, I would say, for something like this. Actually quite nicely sized. And for another comparison here, we have a Mattel Velociraptor and Dilophosaurus next to this figure. And you can see that the Mattel Raptor is pretty similar in size. I think the, again in quotation marks, Indoraptor is slightly larger, but honestly not by much. So if you do have a Mattel Velociraptor, you're definitely going to have a pretty good idea of the size of this figure. And then for one final size comparison, because I don't think we really need too many, I was actually going to bring in a Mattel Indoraptor, but honestly, a Mattel Indoraptor and pretty much every other Indoraptor I have would be way larger than this figure, so I don't think that any actual Indoraptors would compare well with this. It just really wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to do that. So I wanted to bring in one of the epic attack versions of the Velociraptors from Mattel, because I really felt like that was probably the perfect figure to bring in and use as a comparison, because as you can see, these are very similar in size. Since the epic attack versions of the Raptors are slightly larger than your more mainline Raptors, you can see that they size up pretty nicely to each other. And then it was at that point that I decided to go back on what I said and bring in an Indoraptor anyway, not specifically for a size, but I started to think, it would actually be pretty cool to see the two different versions here next to each other to get an idea as far as how different the designs go. And obviously on the right we have the concept art style version, on the left we have the Mattel superposable Indoraptor, I think is what it was called, something along those lines. We have the Mattel Indoraptor, and you can very clearly see when it comes to the designing process, they went through some pretty drastic changes for this dinosaur before finally coming up with the actual version here. But you can see it is pretty darn neat to actually have two different style Indoraptors here next to each other. So this Oenux concept art style Indoraptor is actually kind of cool, and it's probably cooler than most Oenux figures usually are. Not that they're always bad, because they do actually come up with some pretty neat stuff from time to time, but this one is just so out there, it's so unique, and because of that, I'm actually a pretty big fan of it. There are, of course, a few things that I would have done to improve the figure as a whole, like the texturing to the skin looking so awkward. That's probably the biggest one overall that I feel like I really would have changed. The other thing would have been maybe resculpting the head a little bit, because even though I'm taking a look at it here, I am seeing that it does kind of have that Indoraptor type of a look. I feel like they could have just tweaked it a little bit to make it a little bit more accurate. Outside of that, if we switched up the head sculpt and the skin texture, I think the only thing that could have improved the figure a little bit would have been the paintwork of the teeth, because that is one area that does take away from the figure pretty badly, because the teeth are absolutely as sloppy as it gets when it comes to the paintwork. The appearance, I think, doesn't look too bad for the teeth, but it definitely could have been a little more accurate as well, because the Indoraptor has kind of like those erratic, sort of hectic looking teeth, whereas this figure has kind of just like straight running along the gum line teeth. But again, just some things that could have fixed the figure. But if you move past those issues, I think the figure looks pretty nice. They definitely have replicated the overall general appearance of that version of the Indoraptor pretty nicely. They definitely paid attention when looking at that concept art and captured, for the most part, again, everything that you see on that figure and brought it to life here in figure form. And you can't get mad at that, because that's actually really quite cool to have something like this. It's not very often you see any company go ahead and create some sort of a concept art version of a Jurassic dinosaur design. So it is actually cool to see that for once here, created, and again, randomly by Oenux, which I would have never expected. The paintwork on the figure is actually pretty cool, even if it doesn't look exactly as the concept art does, and the paint scheme that dinosaur had. I will say what they have applied here does look neat, and there is some pretty nice smooth transitioning back and forth. It's actually probably one of my favorite paint apps I've seen from the Oenux line so far. Of course, outside of the teeth, because the teeth are sloppy, but the rest of the body I think looks pretty decent. So overall, it's not a perfect figure. It definitely is not. I don't think we'll ever see that from Oenux, but it is a pretty fun one. So if you are interested in grabbing one and adding it to your collection, I will include a link in the description to where you can do that. There is actually a green one as well, so you could get the green one and add that to your collection if that's something you are interested in. Or of course this one, which I felt like looked a lot closer to what the Indoraptor does. Well, the concept art version. One way or another, check those links, grab this if you'd like it, and also like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next review. Thanks for watching.